Our journey begins on the vast, wind-swept Eurasian steppe, a land of endless horizons and ancient whispers, where the Huns first emerged from the mists of prehistory. This immense grassland, stretching from the plains of Hungary to the borders of China, has always been a cradle of nomadic cultures, a place where the rhythm of life was dictated by the movement of herds and the changing seasons. Imagine a world without fixed borders, where the only true boundaries were the distant mountains or the shimmering edge of the desert, and where the sky, a vast dome of ever-shifting blues and greys, was the only constant. It was within this boundless expanse, sometime in the 4th century BCE, that the threads of the Hunnic story began to weave themselves into the tapestry of human history, though their earliest chapters remain frustratingly obscure, like footprints left in shifting sand. The very name, Hun, conjures images of fierce horsemen sweeping across continents with an unstoppable force, yet their true origins are a subject of enduring scholarly debate, a puzzle with many missing pieces. One prevailing theory, though not universally accepted, links them to the Xiongnu, a powerful confederation of nomadic peoples who dominated the eastern steppe for centuries, frequently clashing with the burgeoning Han dynasty of China. The Xiongnu, whose name first appears in Chinese records around 318 BCE, were a formidable presence, their mounted archers a constant threat to the settled agricultural societies to their south. They were masters of horseback warfare, their bows capable of unleashing a deadly rain of arrows with incredible speed and accuracy, a skill honed over generations on the open plains. Their social structure was complex, with a hierarchical system led by a Chanyu, or supreme ruler, and a sophisticated network of alliances and vassal states. For nearly 3 centuries, from the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE, the Xiongnu were the primary antagonists of the Han, their raids prompting the construction and expansion of the Great Wall, a monumental testament to their perceived threat. The decline of the Xiongnu Confederacy in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, due to internal strife and sustained military pressure from the Han and their allies, saw many of their constituent tribes disperse. Some moved south, assimilating into Chinese society, while others migrated westward, vanishing from the direct gaze of Chinese chroniclers. It is among these westward-moving groups that some historians believe the ancestors of the European Huns can be found. The linguistic evidence, however, presents a significant challenge to this neat lineage. The Xiongnu language, known primarily through a handful of transcribed names and titles in Chinese sources, appears to have belonged to a different language family than the fragments of Hunnic speech that can be gleaned from later European accounts. While the Xiongnu language is often tentatively linked to Turkic or Mongolic language families, the few Hunnic words that survive, such as strava, a funeral feast, or medos, a type of honey wine, seem to defy easy categorization, suggesting a language isolate or one with strong influences from various steppe groups. This linguistic divergence is a key point of contention, preventing a definitive identification of the Huns as direct descendants of the Xiongnu. Perhaps, like many steppe confederations, the Huns were a melting pot of different ethnic and linguistic groups, united not by a common ancestry, but by a shared way of life and a charismatic leadership that drew diverse peoples under its banner. The very name Hun itself is a mystery. Did they call themselves Huns, or was this a name given to them by outsiders, a label that stuck? The earliest Roman and Greek sources, which appear in the 4th century CE, use terms like honey or aunoi. The etymology of these names is debated, with some scholars suggesting a connection to Turkic words meaning people or kinsman, while others look to Iranian or even Uralic roots. This ambiguity is a recurring theme in the study of early nomadic peoples, whose histories are often filtered through the lenses of their settled neighbours, who frequently viewed them with a mixture of fear and fascination. The Huns, in particular, were often described in highly sensationalized terms by Roman writers, who portrayed them as monstrous, almost subhuman figures, an effective rhetorical tool for demonizing a formidable enemy. One of the most enduring scholarly disputes surrounding the Huns concerns their ethnic composition. Were they a single, ethnically homogeneous group, or a multi-ethnic confederation, much like the Xiongnu before them? The archaeological record, though sparse for their earliest period, hints at a diverse material culture, suggesting that as they moved westward, they incorporated various peoples into their ranks. Alans, Goths, Sarmatians, and others who had long inhabited the western steppe and the fringes of the Roman world. This process of assimilation and absorption was a common characteristic of successful nomadic empires, which often grew by attracting new followers with promises of plunder, protection, and opportunities for advancement. A charismatic leader capable of uniting disparate tribes was often the linchpin of such confederations, and the Huns, as we will see, certainly produced such figures. The steppe itself played a crucial role in shaping the Hunnic identity and their military prowess. It was a landscape that demanded resilience, adaptability, and a deep understanding of horses. The steppe horse, smaller and hardier than its European counterparts, was not merely a means of transport, but an extension of the warrior himself. Hunnic children, it is said, learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk. Their lives intertwined with these magnificent creatures. They developed a unique style of warfare, characterized by lightning-fast raids, feigned retreats, and devastating volleys of arrows, all executed from horseback. Their composite bows, made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, were powerful weapons, capable of piercing armor at considerable distances. This mastery of mounted archery gave them a distinct advantage over the infantry-heavy armies of the Roman Empire, who struggled to counter their speed and maneuverability. Before their dramatic appearance on the European stage, the Huns likely spent centuries migrating across the vastness of Central Asia, a slow, inexorable drift westward, driven perhaps by climatic changes, pressure from other nomadic groups, or simply the lure of richer pastures. This period, from roughly the 2nd to the 4th century CE, is a historical void, a blank space on the map of their journey. We have no direct accounts of their movements during this time, only tantalizing hints and educated guesses. Perhaps, during these long marches, under the indifferent gaze of the stars, they encountered diverse cultures, absorbed new technologies, and refined their military tactics, forging the formidable fighting force that would eventually shake the foundations of the Roman world. The steppe, in its vast silence, must have witnessed countless campfires, heard the murmur of unfamiliar languages, and felt the thunder of countless hooves, all part of the slow, deliberate shaping of a people destined for greatness. One lesser-known detail about the early Huns, often overlooked amidst the tales of their martial prowess, is their sophisticated use of felt. Far from a simple material, Felt was central to their nomadic existence. They crafted their yurts, their portable dwellings, from felt, providing insulation against the harsh steppe winters and the scorching summer sun. Their clothing, their saddles, even their elaborate burial shrouds, were often made of felt. This material, produced by compressing and matting wool fibers, was lightweight, durable, and highly versatile, perfect. Exactly suited to a mobile lifestyle, it speaks to a deep practical knowledge and an ingenious adaptation to their environment, a testament to their resourcefulness beyond mere warfare. This mastery of felt production points to a stable, if mobile, society, capable of producing complex textiles and maintaining a distinct material culture even as they moved across vast distances. The very concept of a Hunnic identity itself is fluid and complex. It was likely less about a shared genetic heritage and more about a political and military allegiance. As they moved westward, they encountered and incorporated various Iranian-speaking groups, such as the Alans and Sarmatians, who had long inhabited the Pontic steppe north of the Black Sea. These groups, themselves skilled horsemen, contributed to the Hunnic military machine, bringing their own traditions and fighting styles. This constant absorption of new peoples meant that the Hunnic Confederation was a dynamic, ever-changing entity, a mosaic of different cultures and languages bound together by a common leadership and a shared purpose. To imagine the Huns as a monolithic, ethnically pure group is to misunderstand the very nature of steppe empires. They were, in essence, a force of nature, an aggregation of power and ambition that drew in all who sought opportunity or feared their might. The first definitive appearance of the Huns in European historical records occurs around 370 CE, when they burst onto the scene in the region of the lower Volga River. Their arrival was cataclysmic, unleashing a chain reaction that would reshape the geopolitical landscape of Europe for centuries to come. Before this, they were, for the most part, an unknown quantity to the Roman world, a distant rumor, if anything. Ammianus, a Roman historian of the late 4th century, vividly describes their southern appearance, painting a picture of a terrifying, almost alien people. The nation of the Huns, which is mentioned in the ancient records, lives beyond the Sea of Azov, next to the frozen ocean, and is of a savage wildness beyond all description. While Ammianus's account is undoubtedly coloured by Roman fear and prejudice, it captures the profound shock and disruption their arrival caused. Their initial targets were the Alans, a powerful nomadic people who controlled vast territories north of the Black Sea. The Alans, though formidable warriors themselves, were overwhelmed by the ferocity and speed of the Hunnic assault. Many were slaughtered, but a significant portion were subjugated and incorporated into the Hunnic host, adding their own martial skills and knowledge of the western steppe to the burgeoning Hunnic power. This pattern of conquest and assimilation would become a hallmark of Hunnic expansion. From the Alans, the Huns turned their attention to the Gothic kingdoms, particularly the Grufungi, led by their king Ermanaric. The Goths, a Germanic people who had migrated into the region centuries earlier, had established powerful and relatively settled kingdoms on the steppe. Their encounter with the Huns would prove to be a turning point in European history, marking the beginning of the Great Migrations, or the Volkerwanderung, a period of intense population movement and upheaval that would ultimately contribute to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. The Goths, despite their own military prowess, were no match for the Hunnic onslaught. Their infantry formations, while effective against other Germanic tribes, were vulnerable to the Huns' mounted archers, who could strike and withdraw before the Goths could effectively counter. The Hunnic tactic of feigned retreats, drawing their enemies into ambushes, proved particularly devastating. The Gothic king Ermanaric, a legendary figure in Germanic sagas, is said to have committed suicide rather than face the humiliation of defeat. This account, though perhaps embellished, underscores the profound psychological impact of the Hunnic invasion. The sheer terror they inspired was as potent a weapon as their bows and arrows. The surviving Goths, shattered and terrified, fled westward, seeking refuge within the borders of the Roman Empire, setting in motion a chain of events that would have far-reaching consequences. This flight of the Goths across the Danube River in 376 CE, seeking asylum from the Huns, is a pivotal moment. It was an unprecedented influx of people into Roman territory, straining the empire's resources and ultimately leading to the disastrous Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, where a Roman army was annihilated and the Emperor Valens himself was killed. This battle, a direct consequence of the Hunnit pressure, is often seen as a significant marker in the decline of the Western Roman Empire. It demonstrated the vulnerability of Roman military power and the profound impact that external pressures, particularly from the steppe, could have on its stability. The Huns, though not directly involved in Adrianople, were the unseen hand that pushed the dominoes, initiating a cascade of events that would forever alter the course of European history. The Huns, having shattered the Gothic kingdoms, now controlled a vast swathe of the Pontic steppe, establishing themselves as the dominant power in the region. Their confederation continued to grow, attracting new followers and incorporating conquered peoples. They were not merely destructive raiders. They were also skilled administrators, at least in their own nomadic fashion, capable of organizing vast numbers of people and resources. They established a system of tribute, demanding payments from the peoples they conquered, and their leaders, through a combination of charisma and ruthlessness, maintained control over a diverse and often fractious collection of tribes. The image of the Huns as purely savage and uncivilized, propagated by Roman writers, belies a more complex reality of a sophisticated nomadic society, adapted to its environment and highly effective in its pursuit of power and wealth. The enduring mystery of the Huns' origins, the linguistic puzzles, and the scholarly debates surrounding their ethnic makeup all contribute to their allure. They remain a people shrouded in a certain mystique, emerging from the vast, silent spaces of the steppe to leave an indelible mark on history before receding once more into the shadows. Their story is a powerful reminder of the dynamic interplay between settled and nomadic societies, and how the movements of peoples across vast distances can reshape civilizations. The steppe, that ancient, unchanging sea of grass, continued to whisper its secrets, and among them, the tale of the Huns, born of its winds and its boundless horizons, was perhaps the loudest and most impactful. If you're enjoying this, make sure to subscribe and leave in the comments the time and place you're listening from. Long before their thunderous arrival on the European stage, the Huns were known by another name, one that resonated with fear and awe across the vast plains of ancient Asia, the Xiongnu. For centuries, these formidable horsemen dominated the steppes north of China, their history inextricably woven with that of the mighty Han dynasty. It was here, in the crucible of this prolonged and often brutal conflict, that the Xiongnu honed the martial skills and strategic cunning that would later define their descendants, the Huns. Imagine the sprawling landscape of Inner Mongolia and the Siberian steppes, a land of endless horizons, harsh winters, and windswept grasslands. This was the Xiongnu heartland, a place where life demanded resilience and adaptability. Their society was nomadic, centered around herds of horses, cattle, and sheep, which provided sustenance, clothing, and the very foundation of their mobile power. Their yurts, easily dismantled and reassembled, dotted the landscape, shifting with the seasons in pursuit of fresh pastures. This constant movement fostered a deep connection to the land and an unparalleled mastery of horsemanship, skills that would prove decisive in their military encounters. The first major clashes between the Xiongnu and the burgeoning Chinese states date back to the Warring States period, even before the unification of China under the Qin dynasty. But it was with the rise of the Han dynasty in the 3rd century BCE that the rivalry escalated into an epic struggle for dominance. The Han, with their settled agricultural society, walled cities, and vast armies, represented a stark contrast to the nomadic Xiongnu. Yet for all their sophistication, the Han found themselves constantly vexed by the swift, elusive raids of their northern neighbours, the Xiongnu. Under charismatic leaders known as Chanyus, were not merely disorganized raiders. They forged a powerful confederacy of various nomadic tribes, creating a centralized political and military structure that could challenge the Han Empire. Their military tactics were revolutionary for their time. Highly mobile cavalry units, skilled archers who could fire accurately from horseback, and a strategy of feigned retreats to lure their enemies into ambushes. They struck with lightning speed, plundering border settlements, then vanishing back into the steppes before the slower-moving Han armies could effectively respond. One of the most significant figures in Xiongnu history was Modu Chanyu, who rose to power around 209 BCE. The story of Modu's ascent is steeped in legend, a tale of ruthless ambition and cunning. It is said that his father, Tuman Chanyu, sought to disinherit him, even sending him as a hostage to a rival tribe. Modu, however, escaped, and through a series of calculated maneuvers, including training his personal guard to shoot at whatever he shot at, even his own favorite horse, his wife, and finally his father, he seized control. Under Modu, the Xiongnu Confederacy reached its zenith, expanding its territory and consolidating its power over numerous nomadic groups. He inflicted a humiliating defeat on the Han Emperor Gaozu in 200 BCE at the Battle of Beideng, trapping the emperor and his forces for 7 days. This event forced the Han to adopt a policy known as Heqin, or peace and kinship, which involved sending Han princesses as brides to Xiongnu leaders, along with lavish gifts of silk, grain, and other goods, essentially paying tribute to maintain a fragile peace. This policy, though often seen as a sign of Han weakness, was a pragmatic attempt to stabilize the volatile northern frontier and prevent further devastating raids. It highlights the immense power the Xiongnu wielded during this period. For several decades, the Han Empire, despite its vast resources, struggled to effectively counter the Xiongnu threat. Their military was largely composed of infantry, ill-suited for pursuing the fast-moving Xiongnu cavalry across the Ob. In steppes, the cost of maintaining border garrisons and launching punitive expeditions was immense, draining the imperial treasury. However, the Han were not passive victims. They learned from their defeats and adapted. Over time, they developed their own formidable cavalry forces, bred better horses, and improved their military organization. Emperor Wu of Han, who reigned from 141 to 87 BCE, initiated a more aggressive stance against the Xiongnu. He launched a series of massive military campaigns, sending armies deep into Xiongnu territory, often numbering in the tens of thousands. These campaigns, though incredibly costly in terms of lives and resources, aimed to break the Xiongnu's power and secure the northern borders. One of the most famous Han generals of this era was Wei Qing, a brilliant strategist who led several successful expeditions against the Xiongnu. His nephew, Huo Qubing, was another military prodigy. known for his daring and swift maneuvers. In 121 BCE, Huo Bing led a campaign that pushed the Xiongnu far to the west, capturing a significant portion of their territory and even seizing a golden statue of a Xiongnu god, a symbolic blow to their spiritual power. These victories were hard-won, often involving grueling marches through inhospitable terrain and fierce battles. The protracted conflict between the Han and Xiongnu was not just a series of battles, it was a complex interplay of diplomacy, trade, espionage, and cultural exchange. While they were bitter enemies, there was also a degree of interaction. Han defectors sometimes joined the Xiongnu, offering their knowledge of Chinese military tactics and administration. Xiongnu leaders, in turn, sometimes adopted aspects of Chinese court etiquette or sought Han artisans. The Silk Road, which was beginning to flourish during this period, also played a role, as both empires sought to control lucrative trade routes. Historians still debate the precise reasons for the eventual decline of the Xiongnu Confederacy. Was it the relentless military pressure from the Han, which gradually weakened their resources and manpower, or were internal divisions and succession struggles among the Xiongnu leadership more significant? Perhaps environmental factors, such as prolonged droughts or harsh winters, played a role in disrupting their nomadic economy and fostering internal strife. It is likely a combination of these factors contributed to their eventual fragmentation. By the 1st century CE, the Xiongnu Confederacy had fractured into two main branches: the southern Xiongnu, who eventually submitted to Han suzerainty and settled within the empire's borders, and the northern Xiongnu, who continued to resist but were increasingly weakened. The southern Xiongnu, while living under Han protection, often served as a buffer against other nomadic tribes and sometimes even participated in Han military campaigns. This assimilation, however, was not always smooth, leading to further tensions and occasional rebellions. The northern Xiongnu, facing continued Han pressure and attacks from other nomadic groups like the Xianbei, began a gradual westward migration. This movement, slow and incremental at first, would eventually lead them across the vast Eurasian steppes, a journey spanning centuries and countless generations. They were pushed by the Han, but also pulled by the promise of new pastures and opportunities further west. This exodus was not a single coordinated migration, but rather a series of movements by various groups, some retaining the Xiongnu identity, others merging with new peoples they encountered along the way. It is this westward movement of the northern Xiongnu, often referred to as the Great Migration, that forms the crucial link to the Huns who would later appear in Europe. While the exact genealogical connection remains a subject of scholarly debate, the prevailing theory, supported by archaeological evidence and historical accounts, posits that the Huns of Europe were descendants, or at least a significant part, of these migrating northern Xiongnu. The name itself, Hun, is thought to be a phonetic variation of Xiongnu, carried across continents and languages. The journey across the steppes was arduous, a testament to their resilience and nomadic way of life. They traversed vast distances, encountering and absorbing various Turkic, Iranian, and Ugric-speaking peoples along the way. Each encounter, each new environment, subtly reshaped their culture, their language, and their military organization. They were not a static entity, but a dynamic, evolving force, constantly adapting to new challenges and opportunities. Imagine the sheer scale of this migration. Families, entire tribes, moving with their herds, their yurts, their possessions, across thousands of miles of often unforgiving landscape. they would have navigated towering mountain ranges, crossed mighty rivers, and endured extreme climates. Their survival depended on their deep knowledge of the land, their exceptional horsemanship, and their ability to forge alliances or dominate other groups they encountered. These centuries of movement were a continuous test of their endurance and their martial prowess. The Xiongnu's legacy in the East was profound. They forced the Han dynasty to invest heavily in military defense, leading to the construction and expansion of the Great Wall. They stimulated the development of Chinese cavalry tactics and horse breeding. Their presence on the northern frontier was a constant geopolitical factor that shaped Han foreign policy for centuries. The Hekin policy, while seemingly a concession, also fostered a complex diplomatic relationship that sometimes involved cultural exchange. The wars with the Xiongnu also had a lasting impact on Chinese identity, solidifying the concept of China as a civilized agricultural empire distinct from the barbarian nomadic peoples of the north. This dichotomy, though simplistic, became a recurring theme in Chinese historical narratives. The Xiongnu, for their part, left behind a rich archaeological record, including elaborate tombs filled with gold artifacts, intricate bronzework, and evidence of their sophisticated nomadic culture. These discoveries offer tantalizing glimpses into their beliefs, their social structure, and their artistic traditions. As the northern Xiongnu faded from the direct historical records of China, their story continued, albeit under a new name and in new lands. The skills they honed in their centuries-long struggle with the Han, their unparalleled horsemanship, their mastery of the composite bow, their swift and decisive military tactics, and their ability to forge powerful confederations, were the very attributes that would terrify the Roman Empire centuries later. The echoes of their Eastern Empire, of their clashes with the Han, resonated across the vast plains, carried by the winds of migration, until they finally reached the distant lands of Europe, bringing with them a legacy of fear and conquest. The training ground for the Huns of Attila's era was the unforgiving steppes and the battlefields against the mighty Han, a crucible that forged their indomitable spirit and their terrifying effectiveness. The winds that had long rustled through the steppes, carrying the scent of wild herbs and distant campfires, began to shift, bringing with them a chill that was more than just meteorological. It was a premonition, a subtle change in the very fabric of the nomadic world that had sustained the Huns for centuries. For generations, their lives had been an intricate dance with the land, following the seasonal migrations of their herds, their tents rising and falling like ephemeral blossoms across the vast grasslands. But now, the rhythm was faltering, the harmony disrupted by forces both internal and external, pushing them inexorably towards a destiny they could not yet fathom. The first whispers of discontent were carried on those changing winds, born from the very heart of their society. The Hunnic Confederation, while formidable, was not a monolithic entity. It was a tapestry woven from numerous clans and tribes, each with its own chieftains, its own traditions, and its own ambitions. While the Xiongnu, their ancestors, had achieved a remarkable degree of unity under powerful leaders like Modu Chanyu, the centuries had seen a fragmentation of power. The vastness of the steppes, while offering boundless freedom, also made centralized control a constant challenge. Rivalries simmered beneath the surface, occasionally erupting into open conflict, weakening the collective strength of the Hunnic peoples. These internal struggles, though often localized, created a ripple effect, destabilizing the delicate balance of power and making them more vulnerable to external pressures. One of the most profound pressures was the relentless march of climate change. While not a sudden, cataclysmic event, the gradual desiccation of the eastern steppes was a slow, suffocating squeeze. The lush pastures that fed their countless horses and livestock began to recede, replaced by parched earth and sparse scrub. The rivers, once swollen with snowmelt, dwindled to trickles, their banks cracked and dusty. For a people whose very existence was predicated on the abundance of their herds, this environmental degradation was an existential threat. Fodder became scarce, leading to smaller, weaker animals and, consequently, less food and fewer resources for the people themselves. The struggle for survival intensified, turning neighbour against neighbour in the desperate search for greener pastures. This slow, agonizing environmental shift, likely occurring over several generations, pushed many Hunnic groups to look beyond their traditional territories for sustenance. Compounding these internal and environmental challenges were the persistent pressures from rival nomadic groups. The steppes were a crucible of constant interaction and competition. To the east, the Han dynasty, though often a formidable foe, had also served as a kind of buffer, their fluctuating power creating opportunities and constraints. But as the Han waned, other nomadic powers rose to prominence. The Xianbei, a formidable confederation of proto-Mongolic peoples, emerged as a dominant force. They were not merely raiders, they were organized, ambitious, and increasingly encroaching upon Hunnic lands and resources. Historians still debate the exact nature and intensity of these interactions, with some suggesting a gradual displacement and others arguing for more direct military confrontations. What is clear, however, is that the Xianbei exerted significant pressure, pushing the Huns further west, much like a slow-moving glacier carving its path through a landscape. This westward drift was not a sudden coordinated invasion, but rather a series of smaller, localized movements as individual Hunnic clans, facing pressure from the east and scarcity at home, sought new opportunities and safer havens. Imagine the decision-making process within a Hunnic clan. The elders, their faces weathered by sun and wind, gathered around a crackling fire, discussing the dwindling herds, the parched lands, the Encro, aching Xianbei warriors. The choice was stark: stay and face certain decline, or uproot their entire lives and venture into the unknown. It was a choice born not of ambition, but of necessity, a testament to the resilience and adaptability that would define them. This westward movement was not a swift, organized migration of an entire nation. Instead, it was a gradual, almost imperceptible drift of numerous smaller groups, like tendrils reaching out across the vastness. Some groups moved south, eventually settling near the borders of the various Chinese dynasties, sometimes serving as mercenaries, sometimes as raiders. Others, the ones who would eventually become known to the Romans, turned their gaze west, towards the setting sun and the promise of new lands. This initial stage of their migration, often called the Great Migration by later historians, was less the unified march and more a series of incremental movements, each driven by immediate needs and local pressures. As they moved, they absorbed other smaller tribes, some willingly joining the powerful Hunnic confederation for protection or opportunity, others subjugated by force. This process of assimilation and conquest was a hallmark of nomadic empires, constantly expanding their human and material resources. The Hunnic identity itself was fluid, a mosaic of diverse peoples united under a common banner, a shared way of life, and increasingly a shared destiny. Their journey was long, spanning many generations and covering thousands of miles. They traversed the vast steppes of Central Asia, a landscape of endless horizons where the sky met the earth in an unbroken line. They rode through the fertile valleys of the Sirdarya and Amudarya rivers, past ancient cities that had seen the rise and fall of countless empires. They crossed formidable mountain ranges, their horses picking their way through narrow passes, their children bundled against the biting cold. Each sunrise brought them closer to the distant lands of the West. Each sunset left behind the echoes of their ancestral homes. One of the lesser-known aspects of this early migration is the impact it had on the linguistic landscape of the steppes. As the Huns moved, they encountered and interacted with a multitude of different language groups: Turkic, Iranian, and various Paleo-Siberian languages. While the core Hunnic language remains a subject of scholarly debate, some argue for a Turkic origin, others for Mongolic, and still others for an isolated language family. Their migration undoubtedly led to a rich linguistic exchange, with words and concepts flowing back and forth between different groups. This linguistic dynamism reflects the fluid and interconnected nature of the steppe world, where cultural boundaries were often porous. The first hints of their presence in the western steppes, specifically in the region north of the Black Sea, began to appear in the Roman historical record around the mid-4th century CE. These were not direct encounters, but rather reports filtering in from the Gothic tribes who inhabited these lands. The Goths, themselves relative newcomers to the region, had established a powerful kingdom stretching from the Danube to the Don. They had grown accustomed to their dominance, their warriors feared throughout the region. But then a new force emerged from the east, a force unlike any they had encountered before. The Gothic historian Jordanes, writing in the 6th century, vividly describes this initial encounter, though his account is steeped in Roman prejudice and myth. He speaks of the Huns as a swarm of warriors, a savage race which dwelt beyond the Maeotic swamp, and paints a terrifying picture of their appearance and ferocity. While we must approach such accounts with caution, recognizing their inherent biases, they nonetheless capture the profound shock and terror that the Huns inspired in those they encountered. Jordanes recounts how the Huns, swift and terrible, fell up on the Alans, a nomadic Iranian people living north of the Caucasus. The Alans, though formidable warriors themselves, were overwhelmed and either subjugated or dispersed. This initial victory served as a terrifying harbinger of what was to come. Following their conquest of the Alans, the Huns turned their attention to the Greuthungi Goths, led by their king Ermanaric, a figure of legendary status who was said to have ruled a vast empire. The Goths were a settled people by this point, with established agricultural communities and a sophisticated social structure. They had built their world with a sense of permanence, a stark contrast to the nomadic fluidity of the Huns. The clash between these two civilizations, one rooted in the land, the other defined by movement, was inevitable. The Huns' approach was swift and devastating. Their cavalry, renowned for its speed and archery, outmaneuvered the Gothic infantry. The sheer psychological impact of their appearance, their strange customs, their fearsome battle cries, their seemingly endless numbers, played a significant role in demoralizing their opponents. Jordanes describes Ermanaric, an old man by this time, being so distraught by the Hunnic invasion that he took his own life, though this detail is often debated by historians. Regardless of the exact circumstances of his death, the fall of Ermanaric's kingdom marked a pivotal moment. It signaled the collapse of Gothic power in the region and opened the floodgates for the Hunnic advance into Europe. The Tervingi Goths, another major Gothic group, led by Fritigern, watched in terror as their Gruthungi brethren were overwhelmed. Faced with the unstoppable Hunnic tide, Fritigern made a desperate plea to the Roman Emperor Valens for permission to cross the Danube River and settle within the Roman Empire. This request, a desperate gamble for survival, was granted, though with disastrous consequences for the Romans. In 376 CE, a massive influx of Goths, numbering in the tens of thousands, crossed the Danube, seeking refuge from the Huns. This event, triggered directly by the Hunnic migration, is widely considered a major turning point in Roman history, marking the beginning of the end for the Western Roman Empire. The Huns, however, did not immediately follow the Goths across the Danube. For a time, they consolidated their control over the vast steppes north of the Black Sea, absorbing the remnants of the Alans and various Gothic tribes into their burgeoning confederation. This period, roughly from 370 CE to the early 5th century, saw the Huns establish a powerful presence in what is now modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia. They became the dominant force in the region, exacting tribute from the local populations and controlling vital trade routes. During this time, the Huns were not a unified, centralized empire in the Roman sense. Rather, they were a loose confederation of tribes and clans, each with its own leader, but all acknowledging the supremacy of a paramount chieftain. This structure allowed for both flexibility and formidable power. When a major campaign was launched, these disparate groups could coalesce into a massive fighting force, their combined strength overwhelming their enemies. But in times of peace, they could disperse across the vast steppes, making them difficult to pin down or conquer. Their lifestyle remained largely nomadic, though they now had access to the richer resources of the Pontic steppe, including more fertile lands and closer proximity to the Roman world. They continued to graze their vast herds of horses, cattle, and sheep, their wealth measured in livestock. Their camps were mobile cities, their felt tents, known as yurts, easily dismantled and reassembled. The constant movement, the mastery of horsemanship, and their formidable archery skills remained the cornerstones of their military prowess. They were, in essence, a living, breathing war machine, constantly honing their skills on the vast training ground of the steppes. The arrival of the Huns in Europe was not merely a military invasion. It was a profound cultural shockwave. For centuries, the Roman world had viewed the lands beyond its borders with a mixture of disdain and fear, but always with a sense of its own inherent superiority. The Huns, with their alien customs, their fearsome appearance, and their seemingly unstoppable advance, shattered this complacency. They were an entirely new kind of threat, one that defied easy categorization or conventional military tactics. Their impact on the demographics of Europe was also immense. The pressure they exerted from the east set in motion a chain reaction of migrations and displacements. The Goths, Vandals, Suebi, and other Germanic tribes, fleeing the Hunnic advance, poured into the Roman Empire, seeking refuge and new lands. This mass movement of peoples, often referred to as the barbarian invasions, was a direct consequence of the Hunnic arrival. It was as if a giant rock had been dropped into a pond, sending ripples across the entire continent, forever altering the political and social landscape of Europe. The question of why the Huns, after their initial conquests, didn't immediately push further into the Roman Empire remains a point of scholarly discussion. Some historians suggest that their primary motivation was not conquest in the Roman sense, but rather control of resources and tribute. They were content to dominate the steppes and extract wealth from the settled peoples on their periphery. Others argue that they needed time to consolidate their power, absorb new populations, and adapt to the new geopolitical landscape. Perhaps, too, the sheer vastness of the Roman Empire, with its fortified cities and organized legions, presented a more formidable challenge than the scattered Gothic kingdoms. It was a complex interplay of factors, a pause before the storm that would eventually break over the heart of Europe. The Huns had arrived. They were no longer a distant, nebulous threat from the Far East, but a tangible, terrifying presence on the very doorstep of the Roman world. Their long journey, born of internal strife, climate change, and the relentless pressure of rival nomadic groups, had culminated in this moment. The stage was set for their dramatic entry into European history, an entry that would forever change the course of the continent and leave an indelible mark on the collective memory of the West. The winds of the steppes had carried them far, and now those same winds would carry the tales of their power and their terror across the length and breadth of the Roman Empire. The winds that carried the Huns westward across the vast plains of Eurasia were not merely currents of air. They were harbingers of change, whispering tales of an approaching storm that would soon engulf the established world. As the 4th century drew to a close, a new and terrifying force emerged on the fringes of the Roman Empire, a force unlike any it had encountered before. Their arrival was not a gradual infiltration, but a sudden, violent eruption, sending shockwaves across a civilization already grappling with internal strife and external pressures. The year 370 CE, or thereabouts, marks a pivotal moment, as the Huns, with their distinct appearance and fearsome reputation, first truly entered the consciousness of the Roman world, forever altering its trajectory. Imagine the sheer terror that must have gripped the Goths, a Germanic people who had long dwelled north of the Danube. As these strange new warriors swept into their lands, the Goths had their own formidable military traditions, honed through generations of conflict and migration. Yet against the Huns, their usual tactics proved futile. Contemporary accounts, often steeped in fear and exaggeration, paint a picture of an unstoppable horde. Jordanes, a Goth historian writing in the 6th century, though perhaps biased, describes the Huns as a savage race born from foul demons. Their faces scarred and their bodies hardened by a life of relentless warfare. While such descriptions are clearly hyperbolic, they underscore the profound psychological impact the Huns had on those who first encountered them. The Goths, accustomed to infantry formations and heavy armor, found themselves facing an enemy that moved with bewildering speed and agility. The Huns were master horsemen, virtually living in the saddle. Their composite bows, crafted from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, were incredibly powerful and could be fired with deadly accuracy from horseback, even at a full gallop. This was a revolutionary style of warfare for the Romans and Goths alike. Instead of engaging in pitched battles of attrition, the Huns would swarm, unleash volleys of arrows, and then melt away, only to reappear from an unexpected direction. This hit-and-run tactic, coupled with their sheer numbers and relentless pursuit, sowed panic and disarray. One of the lesser-known details about their fighting style, often overlooked in the broader narrative, is their use of a particular type of lasso or snare, sometimes referred to as a haka. While not a primary weapon, it was employed to dismount opponents or capture livestock with chilling efficiency. This detail, though minor, speaks to their adaptability and resourcefulness, employing every tool at their disposal to gain an advantage. It highlights their pragmatic approach to warfare, where anything that contributed to victory was embraced. The initial encounters were catastrophic for the Goths. The Visigoths, led by their chieftain Fritigern, were among the first to bear the brunt of the Hunnic onslaught. Faced with utter annihilation, they made a desperate plea to the Roman Emperor Valens in 376 CE, begging for permission to cross the Danube and settle within Roman territory. This was an unprecedented request, a massive influx of an entire people seeking refuge from an unseen terror. Valens, perhaps seeing an opportunity to bolster his legions, or simply underestimating the logistical challenges, granted their request. But the terms were harsh, and the Roman officials tasked with their resettlement proved corrupt and cruel. This decision, born of fear and desperation, inadvertently set in motion a chain of events that would have profound consequences for the Roman Empire. The mistreatment of the Goths by Roman officials, who exploited their vulnerability and withheld promised provisions, ignited a furious rebellion. These same Goths, who had sought refuge from the Huns, now turned their wrath upon their supposed protectors. In 378 CE, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Visigoths decisively defeated a large Roman army, killing Emperor Valens himself. This was a stunning blow, a clear signal that the Roman Empire was no longer invincible. While the Huns were not directly involved in the battle, their arrival had been the catalyst, forcing the Goths into Roman lands and ultimately leading to this catastrophic defeat. The arrival of the Huns thus initiated a domino effect across Europe. Their pressure on the Germanic tribes pushed these peoples into Roman territory, accelerating the process of migration and upheaval that would eventually contribute to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Historians still debate the precise extent to which the Huns were the primary cause of the empire's decline. Was their arrival merely the final push for an empire already teetering on the brink, or did their unique form of warfare and the subsequent displacement of peoples fundamentally alter the geopolitical landscape in a way that made Rome's collapse inevitable? Some scholars argue that internal weaknesses, economic instability, and political corruption were far more significant factors, with the Huns acting as a powerful, but not singular, external stressor. Others contend that the sheer scale of the Hunnic migrations and the terror they inspired created an unprecedented crisis that Rome, in its weakened state, simply could not overcome. It's a complex question, with no easy answers, reflecting the intricate tapestry of historical causation. The Huns themselves, for a time after their initial appearance, did not immediately launch direct attacks deep into Roman territory. Instead, they often acted as a powerful, destabilizing force on the periphery, influencing the movements of other tribes and occasionally serving as mercenaries for the Romans themselves. This period, roughly from the late 4th century to the early 5th century, is often characterized by a more indirect Hunnic influence. They would raid borderlands, extort tribute, and sometimes even form alliances, playing various factions against each other. It was a strategic approach that demonstrated their cunning and adaptability, rather than a mindless rampage. Their physical appearance, as described by Roman chroniclers, also contributed to their terrifying aura. Ammianus Marcellinus, another contemporary historian, wrote of their squat bodies, strong limbs, and broad shoulders. He noted their deep-set eyes, flat noses, and scarred faces, which he attributed to a custom of cutting the cheeks of male infants to toughen them. While this practice is debated among modern scholars, it certainly added to the image of a fierce and unyielding people. Their clothing, too, was distinct. Simple tunics, trousers, and boots, all designed for practicality and durability on horseback. They were said to eat raw or semi-cooked meat, often tenderized by placing it under their saddles as they rode. This image of a people so utterly unlike the Romans, so seemingly untouched by the refinements of civilization, further fueled the narrative of their barbarity. The psychological impact of the Huns cannot be overstated. Their reputation preceded them, often causing panic and flight before a single arrow was fired. This terror factor was a potent weapon in itself. Roman generals and emperors, accustomed to dealing with more predictable enemies, found themselves facing a foe whose motives and movements were often inscrutable. The Huns didn't seek to conquer and administer territory in the Roman fashion. Their primary goals often appeared to be plunder, tribute, and the subjugation of other tribes. This made them all the more difficult to contain or negotiate with, as their objectives were fluid and their loyalty, when given, was often fleeting. Consider the atmosphere in a Roman frontier town as news of Hunnic raids spread. The distant rumble of hooves, the sudden appearance of scouts on the horizon, the terrifying speed with which they could cover vast distances. These were the elements of a nightmare made real. Walls, once symbols of security, now seemed fragile against an enemy that could bypass them or simply ride around them to strike at undefended settlements. The very fabric of society, built on order and predictable patterns, was unraveling under the pressure of this new chaotic force. The Huns' impact was not just military, it was also cultural and demographic. The displacement of so many Germanic tribes, driven westward by the Hunnic advance, led to a mixing of peoples and cultures across Europe. New kingdoms and alliances began to form in the wake of these migrations, laying the groundwork for the medieval world. The Vandals, the Suebi, and the Alans, for instance, were also pushed across the Rhine in 406 CE, a moment often cited as a critical turning point in the decline of the Western Roman Empire. While the immediate cause was often a desire for new lands and resources, the underlying pressure from the Huns was a significant contributing factor. Even the Roman army, renowned for its discipline and organization, struggled to adapt. While they eventually learned to counter some Hunnic tactics, particularly through the use of heavily armored cavalry, cataphracts, and a greater emphasis on missile troops, the initial shock was profound. The Roman military machine, designed for set-piece battles and siege warfare, was ill-suited to chasing down fast-moving nomadic archers across open plains. It forced a re-evaluation of military doctrine and a greater reliance on allied or mercenary forces, often including Goths and other Germanic tribes, who had their own reasons to fear and fight the Huns. The Huns' presence also had an economic impact. Trade routes were disrupted, agricultural lands were laid waste, and cities faced the constant threat of siege or plunder. The Roman state, already struggling with inflation and a shrinking tax base, found itself spending ever-increasing amounts on defense and tribute payments. The flow of wealth, once directed towards infrastructure and public works, was now diverted to appease or repel these new invaders. This further weakened the empire's ability to maintain its vast administrative and military apparatus. The legacy of these early Hunnic incursions was one of profound transformation. They were not merely invaders, they were catalysts for change, accelerating processes that were already underway and initiating new ones. The Roman world, which had long considered itself the center of civilization, was forced to confront an enemy that defied its understanding, an enemy that seemed to emerge from the very edges of the known world, bringing with it a new kind of terror and a new era of upheaval. The echoes of their thunderous arrival would reverberate for centuries, shaping the destiny of empires and peoples across the European continent. Their sudden appearance was indeed a herald, not just of terror, but of a world irrevocably altered. The wind sweeping across the vast Eurasian steppe carried not just the scent of wild grasses and distant campfires, but also the whispers of change, of power consolidating, of a destiny about to unfold. The Hunnic Confederation, though formidable, had always been a tapestry woven from many threads, each chieftain a distinct color, each tribe a unique pattern. For a time, after the death of Uldin, a period of more diffuse leadership had settled over the Huns. There were powerful figures, certainly, commanding respect and allegiance, but none possessed the singular, unifying authority that Uldin had briefly wielded, nor the absolute, almost mythic stature that was soon to emerge. This was a time of internal dynamics, of alliances shifting like sand dunes in a desert storm. The Huns, even in their collective strength, are still a mosaic of disparate groups, each with their own traditions, their own ambitions. Successions were often fluid, sometimes contested, and always dependent on a delicate balance of charisma, military prowess, and the ability to distribute the spoils of war effectively. It was into this intricate, often volatile landscape that two brothers, Bleda and Attila, began to ascend. They were nephews to Rua, a powerful Hunnic king who for a time had held sway over a significant portion of the Hunnic realm. Rua had been a shrewd operator, understanding the delicate art of diplomacy, as well as the brutal efficiency of warfare. He had engaged in negotiations with the Eastern Roman Empire, extracting tribute and maintaining a precarious peace, or at least a manageable level of conflict, along the Danube frontier. Upon Rua's death, around 434 Common Era, the leadership of the Huns passed jointly to Bleda and Attila. This co-rulership, while not entirely uncommon in nomadic societies, often carried with it an inherent tension, a quiet competition for ultimate authority. Bleda, the elder brother, initially seemed to hold a position of nominal seniority. He was, by many accounts, a capable leader, perhaps more inclined towards the established patterns of Hunnic governance, which often involved a degree of consensus among leading chieftains. But Attila, even in these early years, possessed a different kind of fire, a more singular, unyielding ambition that burned with an almost terrifying intensity. The initial years of their joint rule saw a continuation of Hunnic pressure on the Roman empires, both east and west. The Huns, under Bleda and Attila, renewed a treaty with the Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Treaty of Margus, in 435 Common Era. This agreement was less a pact between equals and more a capitulation by the Romans, who desperately sought to buy peace. The terms were harsh. The Romans agreed to double their annual tribute from £350 of gold to £700, return all Hunnic refugees, and provide a market for Hunnic goods. This treaty, negotiated on Roman soil but under Hunnic terms, underscored the growing power of the Huns and the increasing desperation of the Roman Empire. It was a clear signal that the balance of power had shifted decisively. Yet, within the Hunnic leadership, the unspoken contest between Bleda and Attila continued. While they successfully campaigned together, consolidating their hold over various Germanic tribes and extending their influence, the duality of their command was, perhaps, always destined to be temporary. The sources from this period, largely Roman, are naturally biased and often sensationalized when it comes to the Huns. They paint Attila as the more aggressive, the more ruthless of the two. Historians still debate the exact circumstances of Bleda's demise. Was it a natural death, an accident during a hunting expedition, or, as many Roman chroniclers darkly suggested, was it Attila's hand that ultimately removed his brother from the path to absolute power? The truth remains shrouded in the mists of time, a mystery whispered across the centuries. What is certain is that by 445 CE, Bleda was dead, and Attila stood alone as the undisputed ruler of the Huns. With Bleda gone, Attila's leadership transformed the Hunnic Confederation. He was no longer one among several powerful chieftains, nor merely a co-ruler. He was the Khagan, the supreme leader, the singular voice of a vast and terrifying empire. This consolidation of power was not merely a change in title, it was a fundamental shift in the very nature of Hunnic governance. Attila possessed an unparalleled ability to inspire loyalty and fear in equal measure. He was a brilliant military strategist, understanding the strengths of his nomadic cavalry, their speed, their archery skills, their endurance, and deploying them with devastating effectiveness. But he was also a master of psychological warfare, cultivating an image of himself as the Scourge of God, an instrument of divine wrath sent to punish the sins of humanity. This image, carefully crafted and amplified by the terrified Roman populations, became a powerful weapon in itself. Before Attila's arrival, cities would often surrender, their inhabitants fleeing in panic at the mere rumor of his approach. The tales of his cruelty, of the utter devastation wrought by his armies, spread like wildfire, preceding him and often breaking the will of his enemies before a single arrow was fired. This fear was not entirely unfounded. Attila's campaigns were indeed brutal, designed not just to conquer but to terrorize, to extract maximum tribute, and to ensure that no one dared defy him. Under Attila, the Hunnic war machine reached its terrifying zenith. He forged the various Hunnic tribes, along with their numerous subject peoples, Goths, Gepids, Alans, and others, into a cohesive, disciplined, and utterly ruthless fighting force. His camps were not just temporary shelters, they were mobile cities, bustling with activity, yet always ready to strike. The discipline within his army was legendary, a stark contrast to the often disorganized nature of other barbarian groups. Attila demanded absolute obedience, and he received it. His word was law, and his decisions were final. This centralized command structure, combined with the inherent mobility and ferocity of the Hunnic cavalry, made them virtually unstoppable on the open plains. His administrative genius, though often overshadowed by his military prowess, was also significant. Attila understood the importance of maintaining control over his vast and diverse empire. He established a system of tribute collection that was efficient, if brutal, ensuring a steady flow of wealth into his coffers. He also understood the delicate balance of power among his subject tribes, often playing them against each other to prevent any single group from becoming too powerful. He was a master of both carrot and stick, rewarding loyalty with lavish gifts and punishing defiance with swift and brutal retribution. The years following Blaida's death saw Attila embark on a series of devastating campaigns that would forever etch his name into the annals of history. The Eastern Roman Empire, already reeling from previous Hunnic incursions, became his primary target. From 447 CE onwards, Attila launched a series of massive raids into the Balkans, pushing deep into Roman territory. City after city fell before him. Nisus, a major Roman city, was utterly destroyed, its inhabitants massacred or enslaved. The scale of destruction was immense, leaving a trail of desolation that stretched for hundreds of miles. The Roman historian Priscus, who actually visited Attila's court, described the scene at Nisus years later, noting that the ground was still littered with bones and the ruins of buildings, a testament to the savagery of the Hunnic assault. This was not merely raiding, it was a systematic dismantling of Roman infrastructure and a clear message of Hunnic supremacy. The Eastern Roman Emperor, Theodosius II, was forced to sue for peace, and the terms were even more humiliating than before. The annual tribute was tripled to £2,100 of gold, and a vast, depopulated zone was established south of the Danube, creating a buffer between the Huns and the remaining Roman territories. The Romans were also forced to pay a massive one-time indemnity. These payments crippled the Eastern Roman economy, diverting vital resources away from defense and infrastructure, further weakening an already fragile empire. Attila's court, as described by Priscus, was a fascinating blend of nomadic simplicity and imperial grandeur. While Attila himself ate from wooden plates and drank from a wooden cup, eschewing the gold and silver favored by his chieftains, his tent was vast and luxurious, filled with the spoils of war. He received ambassadors from both Roman empires, treating them with a mixture of disdain and calculated diplomacy. Priscus's account offers a rare glimpse into the Hunnic world from a Roman perspective. Describing Attila as a man of short stature with a broad chest, a large head, small eyes, a flat nose, and a thin beard, he was, by all accounts, a formidable presence, radiating an aura of power and authority that commanded instant respect. It was during this period that Attila truly became the Scourge of God. This epithet, initially perhaps a Roman invention born of terror, was embraced by Attila himself. He understood the psychological impact of such a title, using it to instill fear in his enemies and to inspire his own warriors. The belief that he was an instrument of divine judgment gave his campaigns a moral authority, however twisted, in the eyes of his followers. Perhaps these beliefs, born of fear and superstition, truly whispered stories to the stars, echoing the terror that swept across the Roman world. The consolidation of power under Attila was not just about military might, it was also about identity. He forged a shared purpose among the diverse peoples under his command, uniting them under a common banner and a common leader. He created a sense of destiny, a belief that the Huns were meant to conquer, to rule, to reshape the world. This was a remarkable feat, considering the inherent centrifugal forces within nomadic confederations. He transformed a collection of tribes into an empire, albeit one built on conquest and tribute, rather than a settled administrative structure. The sheer scale of Attila's influence is difficult to overstate. He controlled an empire that stretched from the Volga River in the east to the Rhine in the west, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Danube in the south. This vast domain was not a contiguous, centrally administered state in the Roman sense, but rather a network of alliances, vassal states, and directly controlled territories, all held together by Attila's personal authority and the constant threat of his military might. His power was absolute, his will unquestioned. The Western Roman Empire, though not yet directly targeted by Attila in a major way, watched these developments with growing apprehension. They had their own internal struggles, their own barbarian threats, but the rise of Attila presented a challenge of an entirely different magnitude. The balance of power in Europe had irrevocably shifted. The Huns, under Attila, were no longer merely a troublesome border tribe. They were the dominant power, a force of nature that threatened to engulf the entire Roman world. The stage was set for the epic confrontations that would define the final years of Attila's reign, confrontations that would pit the Scourge of God against the last vestiges of Roman power in the West. The consolidation of Attila's power was complete, and the world held its breath, wondering where the unstoppable force would strike next. Attila's shadow now stretched long and fearsome across the continent, a name whispered in dread from the frozen steppes to the sun-drenched shores of the Mediterranean. His reign, though tragically brief, would become the very apex of Hunnic power, an epoch of unparalleled terror and ambition that would forever etch his name into the annals of history. The year 451 CE found Attila's gaze fixed westward, toward the fertile lands of Gaul, a jewel in the crumbling diadem of the Western Roman Empire. The pretext for this monumental invasion was a tangled web of political intrigue, a common thread in the tapestry of late antiquity. Honoria, the sister of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III, had, in a desperate bid to escape a forced marriage, sent a ring and a plea for help to Attila, perhaps even offering herself in marriage. Whether this was a genuine proposal or a desperate cry for aid, Attila seized upon it, claiming Honoria as his promised bride and demanding half of the Western Roman Empire as her dowry. It was a audacious claim, one that guaranteed conflict. The Hunnic war machine, a terrifying amalgamation of horsemen from diverse tribes, swept across the Rhine, a human tide that seemed to engulf everything in its path. Cities like Metz were razed to the ground, their population scattered or enslaved, their ancient stones left smouldering. The sheer speed and ferocity of the Hunnic advance were unlike anything the Romans had faced in centuries. They were not merely raiders, they were conquerors, driven by a leader who understood the psychological impact of utter devastation. As the Huns pressed deeper into Gaul, a precarious alliance began to form against them. Aetius, the masterful Roman general, often called the last of the Romans, found himself in a desperate struggle to unite the disparate peoples of Gaul. His long history of dealings with the Huns, even employing them as mercenaries in the past, now ironically made him their most formidable opponent. He managed to forge an uneasy coalition. Visigoths, led by their aging but still formidable king Theodoric I, Franks, Burgundians, and a smattering of other Germanic tribes, all united by the common threat of Attila. It was a fragile alliance, born of necessity and mutual fear, yet it was perhaps the only hope for Gaul. The two titans, Attila and Aetius, finally met on the Catalaunian plains, a vast expanse believed to be near modern-day Châlons-en-Champagne. though the precise location remains a subject of scholarly debate to this day. Some historians suggest the battle was fought closer to Troy's, while others argue for sites further north. Regardless of the exact coordinates, the stage was set for one of the largest and most pivotal battles in ancient history, a clash that would determine the fate of Western Europe. The air would have been thick with the dust of thousands of hooves, the metallic tang of fear and anticipation. The Hunnic forces, a swirling vortex of mounted archers and lancers, faced the more disciplined, if less numerous, Roman and Visigothic infantry and cavalry. The battle that ensued was a cataclysm, a maelstrom of steel and blood that raged for hours. King Theodoric I of the Visigoths fell in the thick of the fighting, a tragic loss, yet his death only seemed to steel the resolve of his people. Legend has it that his son, Thorismund, rallied his forces with renewed fury, driving back the Huns. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, though not a decisive victory for either side in the traditional sense, was a strategic setback for Attila. He was forced to retreat, his aura of invincibility somewhat tarnished. It was the first time his westward expansion had been truly checked, and it saved Gaul from wholesale destruction. Yet Attila was not a man to be deterred by a single reverse. The following year, 452 CE, he turned his attention to Italy, the very heartland of the Western Roman Empire. This time, there was no Aetius to stand in his way. With a unified army, the Hunnic hordes poured over the Julian Alps, a terrifying torrent. The great city of Aquileia, a vital port and a symbol of Roman strength, was besieged and utterly obliterated. Its destruction was so complete that it was said to be difficult to even locate its ruins centuries later. Other cities, like Padua and Verona, met similar fates. The wealth of Italy, accumulated over centuries, lay vulnerable before the Hunnic onslaught. Panic gripped Rome. Emperor Valentinian III, notoriously indecisive, fled the capital, leaving the city defenseless. It was at this critical juncture that Pope Leo I, a figure of immense moral authority, undertook a daring mission. Along with two prominent senators, Avienus and Trigetius, he journeyed to meet Attila at his encampment near Mantua. What transpired at that meeting remains one of history's most enduring mysteries, shrouded in myth and religious awe. The traditional account, heavily embellished by later Christian writers, portrays Pope Leo I as a miraculous figure, whose spiritual power and eloquent persuasion alone convinced Attila to spare Rome. It is said that the apostles Peter and Paul appeared as spectral figures beside the Pope, intimidating Attila into retreat. While this narrative offers a comforting tale of divine intervention, historians generally seek more pragmatic explanations. Perhaps the Huns' supply lines were stretched thin, making a prolonged siege of Rome impractical. The Roman countryside, though rich, was not endless, and the Huns relied heavily on plunder to sustain their vast army. Another significant factor was likely the outbreak of disease within the Hunnic ranks. The marshy lowlands of Italy, particularly in summer, were rife with malaria and other ailments to which the steppe-dwelling Huns would have had little immunity. Furthermore, Aetius, though unable to confront Attila directly, was reportedly harassing the Hunnic rear, cutting off their foraging parties and supplies. The prospect of a long, costly siege of Rome with a weakened army and an active Roman general nipping at his heels would have been a significant deterrent for Attila. He was a pragmatist, a master strategist who knew when to press an advantage and when to withdraw. The preservation of his army was paramount. Whatever the true reasons, Attila astonishingly turned back, leaving Rome miraculously untouched. This event solidified Pope Leo I's reputation and contributed significantly to the growing prestige and authority of the papacy in the Western world. Attila's campaigns, both in Gaul and Italy, left an indelible mark on the landscape and the collective memory of Europe. He earned the terrifying moniker Flagellum Dei, the Scourge of God, a title that perfectly encapsulated the fear and devastation he wrought. This epithet, first appearing in the writings of chroniclers like Prosper of Aquitaine, reflected the widespread belief that Attila was an instrument of divine wrath, sent to punish a sinful world. His very name became synonymous with destruction, a boogeyman invoked to frighten children, and a harbinger of doom for empires. Yet, despite the widespread devastation, Attila's empire was fundamentally different from those of Rome or Persia. It was not built on a sophisticated administrative structure or a settled agricultural base. It was a nomadic military enterprise, held together by the sheer force of Attila's personality and the continuous acquisition of plunder and tribute. Without a constant stream of new conquests and wealth, the loyalty of the diverse Hunnic tribal confederation was always precarious. The Hunnic Empire, for all its terrifying power, was a transient phenomenon. A meteor streaking across the historical sky. It was utterly dependent on its leader. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, Attila was gone. In 453 CE, just a year after his Italian campaign, Attila died under mysterious circumstances. The most widely accepted account, provided by the contemporary historian Priscus, states that Attila died on his wedding night after a great feast celebrating his marriage to a beautiful young woman named Ildico. He was found dead in his bed, having suffered a severe nosebleed that he choked on in his sleep. Priscus, who had met Attila personally, described the scene with a chilling simplicity. However, other theories persist. Some suggest he was assassinated, perhaps by Ildico herself or by agents of the Romans or Goths. Another, more poetic theory posits that he died of an internal hemorrhage, perhaps brought on by the immense strain and excesses of his life. The exact cause of his death remains a minor historical mystery, a whisper in the wind. His death plunged the Hunnit Empire into immediate disarray. Without Attila's iron will and strategic genius, the fragile confederation of tribes quickly unraveled. His sons, none possessing their father's charisma or skill, squabbled over the succession, further weakening the Hunnic leadership. The subject peoples, long chafing under Hunnic dominance, seized this opportunity to rebel. The Gepid king Arderic, a longtime Hunnic vassal, led a coalition of Germanic tribes that decisively defeated the Huns at the Battle of Nedau in 454 CE. This battle marked the effective end of the Hunnic Empire as a dominant force in Europe. The remaining Huns, leaderless and broken, dispersed. Some were absorbed into other Germanic tribes. Others retreated back eastward, their once fearsome presence fading into the mists of history. The great Hunnic threat, which had terrorized Europe for decades, vanished almost as quickly as it had emerged, leaving behind a legacy of destruction, but also a strange, awe-inspiring tale of a nomadic people who dared to challenge the might of Rome. The fall of the Hunnic Empire, however, did not bring an end to that tumultuous age. Instead, it ushered in a new phase of migrations and conflicts that would further reshape the face of Europe. The power vacuum left by the Huns allowed other Germanic tribes, like the Ostrogoths and the Vandals, to assert their dominance and establish new kingdoms within the former Roman territories. The Western Roman Empire, already weakened by internal strife, economic decline, and the constant pressure of barbarian incursions, was now even more vulnerable. The Hunnic invasions had not directly caused the fall of Rome, but they had certainly accelerated its decline, draining its resources, disrupting its infrastructure, and forcing it to divert vital military strength to its frontiers. The psychological impact was also profound. The Scourge of God had shown that even the eternal city could tremble, and that the old order was truly crumbling. The legacy of Attila and the Huns is a complex one. For centuries, they were remembered primarily as destroyers, a force of nature that brought only ruin. Yet in a strange twist of fate, their very destructiveness inadvertently contributed to the eventual emergence of new, vibrant cultures and kingdoms in Europe. The vacuum they created allowed for the rise of new powers, and the mixing of peoples that followed their invasions contributed to the rich tapestry of medieval Europe. The Huns, though they left no lasting cities or written records of their own, became an integral part of the European historical narrative, a powerful, if terrifying, catalyst for change. Their story serves as a potent reminder of the transient nature of power, the ebb and flow of empires, and the profound impact a single charismatic leader can have on the course of history. As the dust settled on the battlefields of Gaul and the plains of Italy, the echoes of Hunnic hooves slowly faded. The fear they instilled lingered for generations, woven into folklore and legend. But the Huns themselves, the people who had followed Attila across vast distances, seemed to dissolve back into the great Eurasian steppe from which they had sprung. Their language, their customs, their specific tribal identities largely vanished, absorbed or forgotten in the tumultuous centuries that followed. Yet the memory of Attila, the Scourge of God, remained vivid, a chilling testament to the power of a single individual to reshape the destiny of an entire continent, even if only for a fleeting, terrifying moment. The world, scarred and transformed by their passage, slowly began to rebuild, but it would never again be quite the same. The fall of the Western Roman Empire, a process already underway, was now inevitable, and the Hunnic invasions had been one of its most dramatic and devastating chapters. The wind, a constant companion across the vast plains, carried the scent of anticipation as the spring of 451 CE unfurled. Attila, his eyes fixed on the setting sun, knew the moment of reckoning was near. His armies, a fearsome mosaic of Huns, Ostrogoths, Gepids, and a multitude of other subjugated tribes, were poised on the precipice of destiny. Their relentless march westward had carved a swathe of terror and destruction through Gaul, leaving a trail of burning cities and shattered lives. Metz had fallen, its ancient stones crumbling under the weight of the Hunnic siege engines, and the smoke from its ruins still lingered in the air, a grim testament to Attila's ferocity. The city of Orléans, strategically vital on the Loire River, had also been targeted, its walls breached, its people on the verge of despair. Yet, as fate would have it, a formidable alliance had begun to coalesce against the Hunnic tide. Aetius, the Roman general, often called the last of the Romans, had long understood the grave threat Attila posed. He was a man of complex loyalties, having once lived among the Huns as a hostage, learning their ways, and even employing them as mercenaries in earlier campaigns. Now, however, the stakes were too high for such nuanced relationships. Aetius, with the fading power of the Western Roman Empire behind him, sought to unite the disparate peoples of Gaul against the common enemy. His most crucial ally would be Theodoric I, the venerable king of the Visigoths, whose people had settled in Aquitaine and were a formidable military force in their own right. The initial response from the Visigoths had been hesitant. Theodoric, wary of Roman intentions and perhaps still nursing grievances from past conflicts, was reluctant to commit his forces fully. It was the impassioned plea of Avitus, a prominent Gallo-Roman senator and diplomat, that ultimately swayed the Visigothic king. Avitus, travelling to Toulouse, painted a vivid picture of the destruction that awaited them all if Attila was not stopped. He reminded Theodoric of their shared Christian faith, contrasting it with the pagan ferocity of the Huns, and emphasized that a Hunnic victory would mean the end of their independent kingdoms and their way of life. This diplomatic triumph, a testament to Avitus's persuasive powers, brought the Visigoths into the Roman fold, forming a coalition that would stand as the last bastion against Attila's westward expansion. As Attila's forces pressed on Orléans, the combined armies of Aetius and Theodoric arrived just in time, relieving the besieged city and forcing the Huns to withdraw. This retreat was not a rout, but a strategic repositioning. Attila, ever the shrewd tactician, sought open ground where his cavalry could operate with maximum effectiveness. He led his vast horde eastward, towards the plains of Champagne, a region known for its rolling hills and wide open spaces, ideal for the kind of mobile warfare the Huns excelled at. The location chosen for the inevitable confrontation was a vast expanse of land known as the Catalaunian Fields, a name that would forever be etched into the annals of history. The days leading up to the battle were fraught with tension. Scouts from both sides skirmished, testing each other's strength and probing for weaknesses. The sheer scale of the forces gathering was unprecedented. Estimates vary wildly, as they often do for ancient battles, but it is clear that hundreds of thousands of warriors were converging on this single fateful plain. The Roman-Visigothic alliance included not only the disciplined Roman legions and the fierce Visigothic cavalry, but also Franks, Alans, Burgundians, and a myriad of other Germanic tribes, all united by the terrifying spectre of Attila. On the Hunnic side, the diversity was equally striking, with the nomadic horsemen forming the core, supported by their subjugated peoples, each bringing their own fighting styles and weaponry to the fray. Historians still debate the precise location of the Catalaunian Fields. While tradition places it near the modern city of Châlons-en-Champagne, archaeological evidence remains elusive, leaving the exact spot shrouded in the mists of time. Perhaps the very vastness of the plains, the sheer scale of the conflict, made pinpointing a single battlefield difficult. Yet the memory of the event, the sheer magnitude of the human cost, transcends any uncertainty about its geographical coordinates. On that fateful day, likely in late June of 451 CE, the two colossal armies finally clashed. The air would have been thick with the dust of thousands of hooves, the shouts of commanders, and the clang of steel. Attila, ever the master of psychological warfare, positioned his Huns and their most loyal allies in the center, a formidable wedge designed to punch through the enemy lines. On his flanks, he placed his allied Germanic tribes, including the Ostrogoths, who were bitter rivals of the Visigoths. Aetius, in turn, placed his Roman legions on the left flank, providing a steady, disciplined anchor. Theodoric and his Visigoths, renowned for their cavalry charges, held the right flank, ready to unleash their devastating power. The battle itself was a maelstrom of violence, a chaotic symphony of death and destruction. The Huns, with their lightning-fast cavalry and deadly composite bows, rained arrows down upon their enemies, then charged in with their curved swords and lances. The Visigoths, with their heavy cavalry, met the Hunnic charges head-on, their long spears and axes carving through the enemy ranks. The Roman legions, with their disciplined formations and short swords, held their ground, a bulwark against the Hunnic tide. One of the most poignant and tragic moments of the battle occurred when Theodoric I, the valiant Visigothic king, was struck down. Accounts vary, with some suggesting he was thrown from his horse and trampled, while others claim he was killed by an Ostrogothic javelin. Regardless of the exact circumstances, his death was a devastating blow to the morale of his people. Yet instead of faltering, the Visigoths, led by Theodoric's son, Thorismund, fought with renewed fury, seeking vengeance for their fallen king. Thorismund, a fierce warrior in his own right, famously rode through the thick of the battle, rallying his troops and inspiring them to even greater acts of bravery. The battle raged for hours, a relentless grind of man against man, tribe against tribe. The sheer number of casualties was staggering. Contemporary accounts, though prone to exaggeration, speak of tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of dead. The plains of the Catalaunian Fields were said to have been soaked with blood, a testament to the ferocity of the fighting. The Goths, fueled by their grief and rage, pushed back against the Huns, eventually breaking their lines. Attila himself was reportedly forced to retreat to his wagon lager, a fortified camp made of his wagons, where he prepared for a final, desperate stand. He even ordered a funeral pyre to be built, ready to immolate himself rather than be captured alive. As night fell, the fighting subsided, leaving behind a landscape of carnage. The air was heavy with the stench of blood and death. The silence that followed the roar of battle was perhaps the most chilling sound of all. The Roman Visigothic forces, though victorious, were exhausted and had suffered heavy losses. Thorismund, the new Visigothic king, was eager to press the advantage and destroy Attila's army completely. However, Aetius, with his keen strategic mind, saw a different path. He understood that a complete annihilation of the Huns might leave the Visigoths too powerful, potentially posing a new threat to the Roman Empire. He also recognized that the Hunnic threat, though blunted, was not entirely extinguished, and that a weakened Visigothic kingdom might not be able to withstand future Hunnic incursions. Thus, Aetius, with a subtle display of political cunning, convinced Thorismund to return to Toulouse and secure his claim to the Visigothic throne, implying that his brothers might challenge his succession in his absence. This strategic maneuver allowed Attila to withdraw his battered but not broken army from the Catalaunian Fields. The decision to let Attila escape has been a subject of much historical debate. Was it a calculated risk, a pragmatic choice to maintain a delicate balance of power? Or was it a missed opportunity to decisively end the Hunnic threat once and for all? The answer, like so much of ancient history, remains open to interpretation, a testament to the complex motivations and political machinations of the era. Despite Attila's escape, the Battle of the Catalaunian Fields was a monumental victory for the Roman Visigothic alliance. It marked the first significant defeat of Attila in his westward campaigns, shattering the myth of his invincibility. The Hunnic tide, which had threatened to engulf all of Western Europe, was finally stemmed. The battle is often considered one of the most decisive battles in history, a pivotal moment that saved Western Europe from potentially falling under Hunnic domination. Had Attila won, the course of European history might have been irrevocably altered, perhaps leading to a very different cultural and political landscape. The immediate aftermath saw Attila retreat, but he was far from defeated. The following year, in 452 CE, he turned his attention to Italy, unleashing his fury upon the heartland of the Western Roman Empire. Cities like Aquileia, Milan, and Pavia fell to his relentless assaults, their treasures plundered, their populations massacred or enslaved. The city of Aquileia, a major Roman port, was so thoroughly destroyed that it virtually ceased to exist, its very stones scattered, a stark reminder of Attila's destructive power. The terror of the Huns continued to spread even after their defeat at the Catalaunian Fields, demonstrating the enduring resilience and menace of Attila's leadership. Yet the Battle of the Catalaunian Fields had bought precious time, allowing the Western Roman Empire, however fragile, to regroup and prepare for the next onslaught. It had also forged an unlikely alliance between Romans and Visigoths, a testament to the shared threat they faced. The legacy of the battle lived on in the collective memory of the peoples of Europe, a tale of courage, sacrifice, and the desperate struggle for survival against an overwhelming force. The vast plains, once echoing with the cries of battle, now lay silent, perhaps still whispering the stories of the warriors who fought and fell there, their sacrifices forever woven into the tapestry of history. The winds that swept across those fields carried not just dust, but the echoes of a turning point, a moment when the fate of an entire continent hung in the balance and was, against all odds, preserved. The echoes of Gaul's devastation still lingered on the wind, a chilling testament to Attila's ferocity. Yet even as the Roman Empire reeled, a new and unexpected chapter began to unfold. Attila, rather than pressing his advantage deeper into the fractured Western Roman territories, turned his gaze southward, towards the sun-drenched plains of Italy. It was a move that baffled many, then and now, for the rich lands of Gaul seemed ripe for the taking, their defences weakened, their spirit bruised. But Attila, ever the strategist, perhaps saw a different prize, a different path to ultimate dominion. In the spring of 452 AD, the Hunnic hordes, a terrifying mosaic of horsemen and foot soldiers, poured across the Julian Alps, a natural barrier that had long protected Italy from northern incursions. The mountain passes, usually formidable obstacles, seemed to part before their relentless advance. The air, once crisp with the scent of pine, now carried the dust stirred by thousands of hooves and the distant, unsettling hum of an approaching army. The first major city to fall was Aquileia, a prosperous Roman port at the head of the Adriatic. Its walls, once thought impregnable, crumbled under the sustained assault of Hunnic siege engines. The city, a vibrant hub of trade and culture, was utterly obliterated, razed to the ground with such ferocity that it was said to have been completely abandoned for generations, its very memory fading from the landscape. The destruction was so complete that later generations struggled to even pinpoint its exact location. This act of utter annihilation sent a shiver of terror throughout the peninsula, a clear message that Attila was not merely seeking plunder, but a complete dismantling of the old order. From Aquileia, the Hunnic tide flowed westward, engulfing cities like Patavium, modern Padua, Verona, and Mediolanum, modern Milan. Each fell with varying degrees of resistance, but the outcome was consistently brutal. Libraries were burned, temples desecrated, and the accumulated wealth of centuries was either carried away or destroyed. The fertile Po Valley, the breadbasket of Italy, became a landscape of fear and desolation. Refugees streamed southward, their faces etched with terror, carrying tales of unimaginable horror. The once bustling Roman roads, designed for legions and merchants, now groaned under the weight of fleeing families. Their possessions bundled, their hopes dwindling with each step. The Western Roman Empire, still reeling from the Catalaunian plains, found itself in a desperate predicament. Emperor Valentinian III, a figure of increasing weakness and indecision, had retreated to Rome, leaving the defense of the northern territories largely to fate. Aetius, the general who had faced Attila in Gaul, was conspicuously absent from the immediate defense. His resources stretched thin, his political standing precarious. Some historians suggest that Aetius, wary of further weakening his own power base, deliberately held back, hoping to see Attila's forces exhaust themselves against Italy's remaining defences. Others argue that he simply lacked the manpower and logistical support to mount an effective counter-campaign so soon after the previous year's losses. This period highlights a recurring theme in the late Roman Empire: the internal struggles and rivalries that often undermined any unified response to external threats. As Attila's forces drew closer to Rome itself, a palpable dread settled over the Eternal City. Though no longer the administrative heart of the empire, still held immense symbolic power. Its capture would be a blow of unprecedented magnitude, a psychological victory that would resonate across the known world. The city's inhabitants, many of whom had never witnessed such a direct threat, prepared for the worst. Prayers were offered in temples and churches. Walls were hastily reinforced, and the wealthy began to flee, taking what they could carry. Yet, a curious turn of events unfolded. Instead of launching a direct assault on Rome, Attila halted his advance. What transpired next has become one of history's enduring mysteries, a moment shrouded in speculation and debate. According to contemporary accounts, Pope Leo I, accompanied by two high-ranking Roman senators, Avienus and Trigetius, travelled north to meet Attila at the Mincio River, near modern-day Mantua. The exact details of their meeting are scant, but the outcome was clear. Attila agreed to withdraw from Italy. The motives behind Attila's sudden retreat have puzzled historians for centuries, giving rise to numerous theories. The most popular, and perhaps most romanticized, account attributes the withdrawal to the persuasive powers of Pope Leo I. The legend, amplified by later Christian writers, suggests that Leo, a man of immense spiritual authority and diplomatic skill, appealed to Attila's conscience, perhaps invoking divine intervention or the sanctity of Rome. Some versions even describe a miraculous vision of Saints Peter and Paul appearing alongside the Pope, threatening Attila with divine wrath if he did not turn back. While a powerful narrative, it is likely an embellishment, as Attila, a pagan warrior, was unlikely to be swayed solely by Christian pleas. A more pragmatic explanation centers on the logistical challenges facing the Hunnic army. By this point, they had been campaigning for months in Italy, far from their traditional supply lines. The fertile Po Valley had been plundered, but sustaining such a vast force required constant provisions. The summer heat was also setting in, bringing with it the risk of disease, particularly malaria, which was endemic in the Italian marshes. The Hunnic horses, crucial to their military might, would have also been suffering from the unfamiliar climate and lack of adequate forage. There was also the potential threat of a Roman counterattack from the east, as the Eastern Roman Empire, though often at odds with its Western counterpart, would likely not stand idly by while Rome itself was sacked. There are records of Eastern Roman forces being dispatched to the region, albeit slowly, which might have factored into Attila's calculations. Another compelling theory suggests that Attila's own advisors, particularly the Ostrogothic and Gepids chieftains within his confederation, urged him to withdraw. These Germanic allies, who had their own ambitions and often chafed under Hunnic dominance, may have been reluctant to see Attila gain too much power by conquering Rome, fearing it would further solidify his control over them. They might have also been concerned about overextending their forces and leaving their own homelands vulnerable. The historical record suggests that Attila's confederation was always a fragile alliance, held together by his personal charisma and military prowess, but prone to internal dissent. Furthermore, there was the lingering memory of Alaric's fate. Alaric, the Visigothic king who had sacked Rome in 410 AD, had died shortly thereafter under mysterious circumstances, some attributing it to a divine curse for his sacrilege. Attila, superstitious as many ancient leaders were, might have been wary of tempting a similar fate. He was, after all, a conqueror, but perhaps not entirely impervious to the omens and superstitions of the age. Historians still debate the relative weight of these factors, and it is likely that a combination of them contributed to Attila's decision. The logistical strain, the threat of disease, the potential for a Roman counterattack, the internal pressures from his allies, and perhaps even a shrewd diplomatic maneuver by Pope Leo, all played a part in this pivotal moment. Whatever the precise reasons, Attila's withdrawal from Italy was a reprieve for Rome, a breath taken before the empire's inevitable decline. The retreat was not without its own devastation. As the Huns withdrew, they continued to plunder the countryside, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. But the heart of Italy, and Rome itself, was spared the ultimate humiliation of a Hunnic sack. The psychological impact, however, was profound. The vulnerability of the empire had been laid bare for all to see. The image of the Scourge of God had been etched into the collective consciousness of Europe, a terrifying force that could appear almost anywhere, seemingly at will. The year 453 AD dawned, and with it came a sense of uneasy calm. Attila, having returned to his stronghold in Pannonia, began to make plans for new campaigns, perhaps against the Eastern Roman Empire, or perhaps a renewed assault on Gaul. His ambition remained undimmed, his desire for conquest unquenched. However, fate, in its unpredictable way, intervened. Attila, in the midst of celebrating his marriage to a new bride, a beautiful Gothic princess named Ildico, died suddenly in his sleep. The exact cause of his death is another historical enigma. The most widely accepted account, from the contemporary historian Priscus, suggests that he suffered a severe nosebleed during the wedding night and choked to death, possibly exacerbated by excessive drinking. Other theories range from a ruptured blood vessel to poisoning, perhaps at the hands of his new bride or a disgruntled rival. His death was as sudden and dramatic as his life had been. With the passing of their charismatic leader, The Hunnic Empire, a vast and disparate confederation held together by Attila's personal will, began to unravel almost immediately. His sons, none possessing their father's military genius or political acumen, squabbled over the succession. The various Germanic tribes who had been subjugated by the Huns seized the opportunity to rebel. The Battle of Nedao in 454 AD, fought between the Huns and a coalition of their former Germanic vassals, marked the decisive end of Hunnic dominance in Europe. The Huns, though not entirely disappearing from history, fragmented and were absorbed into other groups or retreated eastward, their terrifying shadow lifting from the Western world. The legacy of Attila, however, endured. He had irrevocably altered the course of European history, contributing to the weakening of the Western Roman Empire and accelerating the process of its eventual collapse. His campaigns had displaced populations, destroyed cities, and reshaped the political landscape of the continent. The fear he inspired became a powerful cultural memory, passed down through generations, shaping legends and folklore. Even centuries later, the name Attila evoked images of destruction and unstoppable power. The Italian campaign, despite its unexpected conclusion, stands as a testament to Attila's strategic audacity and the sheer terror he inspired. It revealed the fragility of the Roman Empire, its inability to defend its heartland, and the desperate measures it sometimes resorted to in the face of overwhelming force. The meeting between Pope Leo and Attila, regardless of its precise details, became a powerful symbol of spiritual authority confronting brute power. A narrative that would resonate through the Middle Ages. The retreat from Italy, a decision born of complex factors, ultimately spared Rome from a fate similar to Aquileia, but it could not save the empire from its deeper systemic decline. The Huns under Attila had delivered a series of blows from which the Western Roman Empire would never truly recover, paving the way for a new era in European history, one dominated by the emerging Germanic kingdoms. The silence that fell over the battlefields and sacked cities of Italy after the Hunnic tide receded was not one of peace, but of exhaustion and the quiet, inevitable march towards a profoundly different future. The sudden, unexpected death of Attila in 453 AD sent a shockwave through the vast, if loosely bound, Hunnic Empire. It was a death shrouded in a quiet mystery, a stark contrast to the thunderous life he had led. The official account, relayed by the Roman historian Priscus, suggested a burst blood vessel during his wedding night to a new bride, a beautiful young woman named Ildiko. He was found the next morning, lifeless, with Ildiko weeping beside him. It was a death in sleep, perhaps a hemorrhage, a silent end to a man whose very name had echoed terror across 2 continents. But whispers, as they always do, began to circulate. Could it have been poison? A jealous hand? Or simply the body of a man, worn from relentless campaigns, and a life lived on the very edge of human endurance, finally giving out? Historians still debate the true cause, though the natural explanation remains the most widely accepted. Regardless of the precise medical reason, the effect was immediate and catastrophic for the Hunnic dominion. Attila had been the very sinews and bone of the empire. His personal charisma, his unyielding will, and his sheer military genius were the threads that held together a patchwork quilt of diverse tribes, conquered peoples, and opportunistic allies. He was the sun around which all these disparate elements orbited. With his light extinguished, the gravitational pull that kept them in place vanished. It was as if a great dam had burst, and the pent-up forces of ambition, resentment, and a longing for freedom surged forth. His sons, numerous but lacking their father's singular vision and authority, immediately plunged into a bitter struggle for succession. Elac, the eldest, was designated as his father's heir, a choice that perhaps reflected Attila's own preference for a strong, direct line. But his brothers, Dengizich and Ernak, along with other Hunnic chieftains, were unwilling to accept his primacy without a fight. The Hunnic tradition, unlike the Roman, did not always favor primogeniture. Leadership often went to the most capable, the most feared, or the one who could command the greatest loyalty. This internal strife was a fatal weakness, a gaping wound that would quickly fester. The subject peoples, long chafing under the Hunnic yoke, saw their opportunity. The Gepid king Ardaric, a formidable chieftain who had been a loyal, if sometimes reluctant, ally of Attila, was the first to openly defy the Huns. He rallied a coalition of Germanic tribes, including the Ostrogoths, the Rugians, the Heruli, and others who had been forced to fight in Attila's armies. They had witnessed Attila's power firsthand, but they had also tasted the bitterness of servitude. Now, with the great Khan gone, their courage returned. The decisive confrontation came in 454 AD, just a year after Attila's death, at the Battle of Nedao. The exact location of this battle remains a subject of scholarly discussion, but it is generally believed to have occurred somewhere in Pannonia, perhaps near a river. The coalition of Germanic tribes, led by Ardaric, faced off against the Huns under Elac. It was a brutal and bloody affair, a clash of steel and desperate resolve. The Huns, though still formidable warriors, lacked the unified command and the awe-inspiring presence of Attila. Their formations, once so disciplined under his gaze, fractured under the relentless assault of the rebellious tribes. Elac himself fell in the battle, a tragic end for a son attempting to hold together his father's crumbling legacy. The Battle of Nedao was a watershed moment. It was not merely a defeat for the Huns. It was a devastating blow that shattered their dominance. The Hunnic Empire, which had stretched from the Volga to the Rhine, effectively ceased to exist as a unified political entity. The Germanic tribes, now free, began to establish their own kingdoms in the fertile lands of Pannonia and beyond. The Ostrogoths, under their young king Theodoric, who would later become one of the most powerful rulers in Italy, were particularly prominent among the victors. This victory marked a significant shift in the balance of power in Central Europe, paving the way for the emergence of new Germanic kingdoms that would profoundly shape the future of the continent. After Nedao, the remaining Hunnic factions, led by Dengizich and Ernak, retreated eastward, their power severely diminished. They attempted to reassert their authority, but the magic was gone. The aura of invincibility that Attila had cultivated through decades of conquest had evaporated. They became fragmented, smaller groups, often raiding the borders of the Eastern Roman Empire, but never again posing the existential threat their father had. Dengizich, still clinging to the idea of a unified Hunnic power, continued to harass the Eastern Roman Empire for several years. He led raids into Thrace and Moesia, demanding tribute and attempting to reclaim some semblance of his father's dominion. But the Romans, no longer paralyzed by fear, were more resolute. In 469 AD, after a series of skirmishes and a final, desperate campaign, Dengizich was defeated and killed by the Roman general Anagast. His head was brought to Constantinople, a grim trophy displayed for all to see, a symbolic end to the Hunnic threat. This event, perhaps more than any other, marked the definitive end of the Huns as a major political and military force in Europe. Ernak, the younger son, took a different path. He led his faction of Huns further into the steppes, away from the Roman frontiers and the encroaching Germanic tribes. He is believed to have settled in what is now modern-day Ukraine, merging with other nomadic groups. His descendants may have contributed to the formation of later steppe peoples, such as the Bulgars, who would eventually play their own significant role in European history. This dispersion and assimilation into other groups is a common fate for nomadic empires once their central leadership collapses. The Huns, as a distinct political and ethnic entity, simply faded into the vast tapestry of the Eurasian steppes. The dissolution of the Hunnic Empire had profound and lasting consequences for both the Western and Eastern Roman empires. For the West, it brought a temporary reprieve from the Hunnic threat, but it also unleashed a new wave of Germanic migrations and invasions. The tribes that had been held in check by Attila's power, or had been forced to serve him, now moved freely, often into Roman territory. This contributed directly to the further weakening and eventual collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, a mere 23 years after Attila's death. The vacuum left by the Huns was not filled by a resurgent Rome, but by a mosaic of new barbarian kingdoms. For the Eastern Roman Empire, Constantinople breathed a sigh of relief. While they would still face threats from various steppe peoples and Germanic tribes, the overwhelming, unified force of Attila's Huns was no more. This allowed the East to consolidate its power, develop its own unique identity, and ultimately survive for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire. The Huns had inadvertently cleared the stage for new actors, both Roman and barbarian, to shape the future of Europe. The legacy of the Huns, though their empire was short-lived, is immense. They were a catalyst, a force of nature that accelerated changes already underway in Europe. They pushed Germanic tribes into Roman lands, reshaped political landscapes, and left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of the age. Their memory, often distorted and mythologized, lived on in the sagas and legends of the Germanic peoples and in the fearful accounts of Roman historians. They became the archetypal barbarian, the Scourge of God, a symbol of destruction and chaos. But beyond the terror, there is also the story of an extraordinary people, born of the steppes, who, for a brief, blazing period, forged an empire that stretched across continents. They were master horsemen, skilled archers, and brilliant strategists. Their social structures, though alien to the Romans, were effective for their nomadic lifestyle. They were adaptable, incorporating conquered peoples and technologies into their own. Their disappearance as a distinct entity highlights the fragility of empires built primarily on the strength of a single charismatic leader. As the dust settled on the battlefields of Nideo and the Hunnic remnants dispersed, the forests and plains of Europe began to whisper new names. The Goths, the Franks, the Vandals, the Lombards. These were the tribes that would now vie for power, carving out their own destinies in the twilight of the Roman world. The Hunnic comet had streaked across the sky, brilliant and terrifying. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of smoke and the echoes of hoofbeats in the wind. The vast, silent plains of Eurasia, from which they had emerged, once again absorbed their sons, their stories becoming intertwined with those of other nomadic peoples who would rise and fall in the centuries to come. The grand narrative of Europe, forever altered by their passage, continued to unfold, a complex tapestry woven with threads of conquest, migration, and the enduring human quest for land and legacy. The empire of the Huns, forged in the crucible of Attila's ambition and held together by the sheer force of his will, fractured swiftly after his death in 453 CE. The unity that had bound diverse tribal groups, Ostrogoths, Gepids, Skiri, and many others, under the Hunnic banner, dissolved into a cacophony of competing claims and ancient rivalries. Attila's sons, Elac, Dengizich, and Ernak, each sought to assert their dominion, but none possessed their father's charisma or strategic genius. Their squabbles provided the perfect opportunity for the subjugated peoples to rise in rebellion. The most significant challenge came from the Gepids, a Germanic tribe long chafing under Hunnic rule. Led by their king, Ardaric, the Gepids formed a coalition of Germanic peoples, including the Ostrogoths, Skiri, and Rugi. This alliance confronted the Hunnic forces, still reeling from Attila's sudden demise. At the Battle of Nedao in 454 CE, the precise location of this decisive engagement remains a subject of scholarly debate, with various theories placing it somewhere in Pannonia, perhaps near the Sava River. What is certain is the ferocity of the battle and its devastating consequences for the Huns. Elac, Attila's eldest and most capable son, fell in the fighting, and the Hunnic army suffered a catastrophic defeat. This battle marked the effective end of the Hunnic Empire in Europe as a dominant political and military force. Following Nedao, the remaining Hunnic factions, led by Gengizich and Ernak, retreated eastward, attempting to re-establish their power base north of the Black Sea, in the steppes from which their ancestors had emerged. They continued to pose a threat to the Eastern Roman Empire for several decades, engaging in sporadic raids and demanding tribute. In particular, attempted to revive the Hunnic menace, leading incursions into Thrace and Moesia in the 460s. However, his efforts were met with increasingly effective resistance from the Eastern Roman forces, often employing federated Gothic troops. In 469 CE, Dengizich was killed, his head reportedly sent to Constantinople as a grim trophy, effectively extinguishing the last significant Hunnic military threat to the Roman world. Ernak, the youngest of Attila's known sons, is said to have led a remnant of Huns, often referred to as the Altsenzurs, to settle in Scythia Minor, near the mouth of the Danube. Their presence there gradually faded from the historical record, their identity perhaps absorbed into later nomadic groups or dispersed among the local populations. The swift disintegration of the Hunnic Empire after Attila's death highlights the highly personal nature of nomadic empires, which often relied heavily on the leadership and prestige of a single charismatic figure. Without Attila, the delicate balance of power and loyalty that held the diverse confederation together simply unraveled. Yet, the impact of the Huns on the course of European history was profound and enduring, extending far beyond the lifespan of their empire. Their arrival in the late 4th century had been the primary catalyst for the Great Migration of peoples, pushing Germanic tribes like the Goths and Vandals into the Roman Empire. This massive demographic shift fundamentally reshaped the political and ethnic landscape of Europe, contributing directly to the fragmentation of the Western Roman Empire. The Huns had, perhaps unintentionally, acted as a colossal historical hammer, shattering old orders and forging new ones in their wake. The fear and fascination surrounding the Huns persisted for centuries, weaving itself into the fabric of European folklore and historical memory. In the Germanic sagas, Attila, Etzel, appears as a powerful, if sometimes tragic figure, distinct from the monstrous image portrayed by Roman chroniclers. In the Nibelungenlied, he is a noble king, a powerful ally, and a generous host, albeit one caught up in the tragic fates of others. This duality in his port. Rael, from the Scourge of God to a respected if formidable monarch, speaks to the complex ways in which dominant cultures process and reinterpret the figures of their conquerors. The Huns also left an indelible mark on the development of military tactics and technology. Their mastery of horse archery, their composite bows, and their swift, coordinated maneuvers on the battlefield forced both Roman and Germanic armies to adapt their strategies. The Roman cavalry, in particular, underwent significant reforms in the 5th century, partly in response to the Hunnic threat. The adoption of stirrups, while not definitively attributable to the Huns, certainly became more widespread in Europe during and after their time, revolutionizing cavalry warfare by providing greater stability and allowing for more effective use of lances and swords from horseback. The Hunnic influence on equestrian culture and warfare permeated the steppes and beyond, shaping the military practices of subsequent nomadic groups for centuries. The linguistic legacy of the Huns is more elusive. Their language, often referred to as Hunnic, is largely unknown, with only a handful of words preserved in Greek and Latin texts, primarily personal names and tribal designations. Scholars still debate its classification. Some propose a Turkic origin, others a Mongolic connection, and some even suggest the unique, now extinct language family. The scarcity of evidence makes definitive conclusions impossible, adding to the mystery surrounding their origins and cultural identity. This linguistic void stands in stark contrast to the wealth of information available for many of the Germanic tribes they encountered, underscoring the challenges of reconstructing the history of a people who left no written records of their own. The Huns' impact on the late Roman Empire was particularly profound. They accelerated the decline of the Western Empire by draining its resources through tribute payments, disrupting its economic infrastructure through raids, and forcing it to divert vital military manpower to defend its frontiers. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, though a tactical draw, was a strategic victory for Rome and its allies, but it came at an immense cost, further weakening an already struggling empire. The constant pressure from the Huns contributed to the hollowing out of Roman authority in many provinces, paving the way for the establishment of successor kingdoms by Germanic federates. Beyond the immediate political and military consequences, the Huns entered the collective consciousness as a symbol of untamed, destructive force. Their image, often exaggerated by Roman propaganda, served as a potent warning against the dangers of barbarian incursions. This perception influenced later historical narratives and cultural representations, where the Huns became synonymous with chaos and devastation. Yet, beneath this terrifying veneer, there was a sophisticated military organization and a complex confederation of peoples, capable of both immense destruction and, for a time, remarkable political cohesion. The legacy of the Huns is thus a tapestry woven with threads of fear and fascination, destruction and innovation. They were a force of nature that swept across the Eurasian steppes and into Europe, leaving a trail of shattered empires and transformed societies. Their brief but intense period of dominance served as a powerful reminder of the fragility of settled civilizations when confronted by a determined and highly mobile nomadic power. The fear they inspired, the legends they spawned, and the fundamental shifts they precipitated in the political and demographic landscape of Europe ensured that their memory would endure, even as their empire faded into the annals of history. The remnants of Hunnic culture and people did not simply vanish. Some scholars suggest that elements of Hunnic military organization and certain cultural practices were adopted by subsequent nomadic groups, such as the Bulgars and Avars, who later appeared in Europe. The composite bow, the saddle, and certain aspects of equestrian warfare continued to be refined and utilized by these successor groups, demonstrating a continuity of steppe military tradition that transcended specific tribal identities. The movement of peoples and ideas across the vast Eurasian steppe was a constant, and the Huns were but one powerful wave in a long series of such migrations. Even in modern times, the name Hun occasionally resurfaces, often as a pejorative term for a brutal or uncivilized enemy, particularly during the World Wars. This enduring, albeit distorted usage speaks to the deep impression they left on the European psyche. It is a testament to the power of historical narrative, where the image of a people can persist for centuries, sometimes detached from the nuances of their actual history. The Huns, therefore, represent a pivotal moment in the transition from classical antiquity to the early Middle Ages in Europe. They were a catalyst for change, an accelerant for processes already underway, and a direct cause for many of the political and social transformations that defined the 5th century. Their story is a powerful illustration of the interconnectedness of seemingly disparate regions, the steppes of Asia and the heartland of Europe, and how events in one could profoundly alter the trajectory of the other. The echoes of their thunderous hooves and the whisper of their arrows still resonate through the pages of history, a reminder of a time when the world trembled before the might of a nomadic empire.